Welcome to our Wednesday speaker series. I'm Richard Kravitz. I'm director of the UC Center, and we're really pleased to be presenting this very special program on a really important topic. First, a quick review of some recent and upcoming events. For those of you who were able to make it, you'll know that we had last week our Wednesday speaker series lecture on food insecurity by Sasha Abramsky, followed immediately the following day by a panel on the problem of homelessness in California. And coming up next week at our Wednesday speaker series, we have a talk by the somewhat renowned UCSF professor Stanton Glantz on marijuana retailing, marijuana policy, an important issue for states like California, Colorado, and others. See if I can even read my writing. Oh yeah, the very next day, a panel on drug pricing at one of our Capital Insights programs in the late afternoon. And then for those of you who are focused mostly on education, November 15th, there's a special program on career and technical education as a pathway to higher education for California students. This is all part of our higher education theme, obviously tremendously important for a state as diverse and technologically advanced as ours. Despite those plaudits, as we read in the paper this morning, California actually ranks last in the percentage of students who go directly from high school to a four-year college. Obviously, we need a highly educated student population to create a highly educated and functional workforce. That's kind of the practical side of this. But we also need a population that can think critically about the issues that are going to affect a state with all its many diverse people and diverse problems. That's what we try to do at UC Center Sacramento for our students. You'll have to talk to them to know whether we're successful at that. That's certainly what the University of California as a whole aims to do. The Latino population in California is clearly large and growing, and we can't talk about access to higher education for all Californians without attention to the Chicano, Latino, LatinX population. And so here to do that, we have three distinguished panelists. First, Frances Contreras. She's Associate Professor of Education Studies and Associate Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the University of California, San Diego. She's a graduate of UC Berkeley, Harvard, and Stanford, the author of several books, including Achieving Equity for Latino Students, and now I understand is working on a book on STEM and Latinos. She's the winner of numerous honors and awards and was a gubernatorial appointee to the Achievement Gap Oversight and Accountability Committee in Washington. To her left is Gloria Rodriguez. She's Associate Professor at the UC Davis School of Education. She also has a mixed and highly distinguished educational pedigree with having spent time at UC Santa Cruz, Columbia University, and also this common denominator of Stanford. Her research focuses on education as a community investment, as well as educational and economic trajectories of Latinos and other minorities and low-income populations. She's also received many awards, including several for teaching, and among other service activities, she was a member of the American Education Finance Association Board of Directors. And finally, we're most pleased to have with us Assembly Member Kevin Kiley, who will serve as a discussant today. Mr. Kiley is an assembly member representing California's 6th Assembly District, which includes Placer, parts of Sacramento, and El Dorado counties. He's vice chair of the Privacy and Consumer Protection Committee, and most germane to this program, he's a member of both the Assembly Education Committee and the Higher Education Committee, among others. In a past life, Assembly Member Kiley was a 10th grade English teacher. He is a graduate of Harvard, Yale, and Loyola Marymount, and he served as an adjunct professor at the McGeorge College of Law. So our order of business today, first, Frances Contreras will lead us off for about 20 minutes. She'll be followed by Gloria Rodriguez. Assemblymember Kiley will then make some comments summarizing the remarks of the early two speakers and maybe giving us some policy insights, and then we'll open up for question and answers. We expect the program will go till around 1:15 or 1:20. So without further ado, Frances Contreras.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you to my colega, Dr. Rodriguez from UC Davis, for joining me in our talk today on expanding access to higher education for Latinos in California. I'm going to start off with some snapshot data as well as an overview of how we got here. And then Gloria, I'm going to transition to Gloria, who will talk about investment and costs associated with investing in Latino students. And then we'll wrap up with some of our own policy recommendations. So it really has been a joint effort. So thank you, Gloria. So framing the issue, in terms of framing the issue, why investment is critical to California. Many of you have read some of the headlines, you're reading recent reports and current data, but I want to give you some overview data as a recap. Over 6.1 million Latino children live in poverty today. Over 54% of the California K-12 population is Latino. Latinos will be the largest segment of residents by 2044 in the nation. LatinX residents are already the largest segment of California's population at 40% in 2016. Latinos are the working poor in the state of California, and California, of course, we know is the 5th largest economy in the world. So what is the higher education landscape? All public systems of education in California are HSI systems, are Hispanic serving systems, and I'm going to give you some overview data to help unpack that and explain it. There are currently 5 UCs that are Hispanic serving institutions, which are 25% or more of Chicanx, Latinx students. California is home to 152 HSIs and 59 emerging HSIs in terms of post-secondary institutions. 20 out of 23 of the CSUs are now Hispanic serving institutions. 98 out of 113 community colleges are HSIs, and 55% of the K-12 system are Chicanx, Latinx students. So again, all public systems of education in California are HSIs or emerging HSIs. So back to the UC. What is the role of the University of California as the latecomer? There are 681 ladder rank faculty in the system, which is 4.4%, which is the pipeline, right, in terms of leaders in the system of Chicanx, Latinx faculty. There are only 7 senior managers that are Latinos system-wide, 7. The UC system will join the CSUs and the community college systems in California in becoming HSI systems, but are they LatinX enhancing, which is the work of Silvia Hurtado, or are they achieving equity for Latinx students, which is my own work? And more recent work is how might we raise the bar for HSIs and UC HSIs in the state of California? So let me give you some snapshot data. In terms of an overview of Latinos in higher education, Latino students are more likely to enroll in community colleges or CSUs even if they're eligible for highly competitive UCs. 25% of Latinos transition to community colleges, 10% enroll in the CSUs, 4% enroll in the UC system after high school. More higher education outcomes. Less than 40% of Latinos transfer from community college sector in 6 years, while less than half will graduate from CSUs in 6 years. And the UC in 4 years. So 39% transfer from community colleges in 6 years, 45% graduate from the CSUs in 6 years, and 46% is the 4-year graduation rate from the University of California for Latino students. How did we get here? What's the story behind how we get here? I already mentioned that Latinos work for low wages, that they are the working poor in the state. They represent the highest percentage of children in low-income families in California. 62% of children in low-income families in California in 2015 were Latino students. How does that manifest itself in terms of poverty in pre-K? 38% of Latino children overall live in poverty, which is below the federal line, a smaller number than that, 62%. 43% of Latino children aged 3 to 5 are not enrolled in pre-K in 2014. And 56.4% of the kindergartners retained in 2014 were Latino students, so held back, which means they're not ready for kindergarten. More overview of Latino students. 54% of the K-12 population I already mentioned, 84% of English language learners speak Spanish, and 54% of all students in special education programs are Latino in the state of California. And so when you think about the larger implications of this data, this is partly how we're getting here to the higher ed outcomes. So let me tell you the story about high school students. 77% is the cohort graduation rate in 2014. 65% of English learners graduated in 4 years, so a smaller number than the overall Latino graduation rate. And 29%, this is the key number here, less than a third of Latinos graduates, high school graduates, completed college preparatory classes, the A through G requirements in 2015. So we know that preparation matters, right? Preparation matters if we're going to enhance that pipeline. So this gives you a picture of the California public high school pipeline to UC. And this is the percentage of high school grads with A through G, high school grads, and then the 12th graders, the overall percentage of 12th graders. And so you see the small pipeline all throughout of those that are actually eligible, of those that have a high SAT scores, of those that actually apply, and those that are admitted and enrolled in the UC system. And all along that pipeline, it shows that really this is a fragile pathway. This is a pathway where we actually need to intervene and interrupt some of this data. There's a demand for highly educated workers, and that demand is going to exceed the supply of highly educated workers in California in 2030. What are the larger implications, right? If we're to create communities that are economically sustainable, then we really need to address the needs of the economy, and the economy is changing. So here's some more data. The future of California's economic growth, we know, is going to be in STEM. Are our students prepared for the rigors of STEM jobs in the state of California? The percent of the workforce employed in STEM jobs in 2016, I mean, some of the counties, San Mateo County is 12.16%, but overall in California, we're behind in terms of where we need to be in terms of the level of preparation that exists for what's coming, which is a highly technological, highly STEM-based workforce that we will need. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Rodriguez.
So in all the years that I've known Frances Contreras, she always raises critical issues that I feel keep my head spinning in terms of the ways that we want to connect with that. My background is actually in school finance, and as well as really trying to understand the nexus of resource allocation and leadership. And so when we see the kind of overview that Dr. Contreras has provided, it's at times perhaps a little easier to detach ourselves from the issues of what it takes to support the success of the Chicanx, Latinx community and expanding access to not only our higher education systems, but also to meaningful options and opportunities after. And so, so my attempt here, my contribution is to use this time that we have together to maybe rehumanize a little bit. The numbers are important, right? They're stark. And yet even when we have an idea that those numbers could be better and there's a role for all of us to play in improving those numbers, there's something really important about being able to center our ideas and our thinking on the concerns of real life human beings that we might know very well, including some of you, your own children, your kids in your neighborhood, young learners, and as well as older learners. And I find it very useful to be able to consider when 29%, only 29% of the high school graduates are leaving having some preparation in terms of taking courses that are college preparatory. What does that mean for the young people that we know very personally or who are our constituents or stakeholders in the work that we do in the various roles that we play? So in the work that I've done with my colleague Anthony Roll, we put together this volume that was really asking us to get back to our understanding of the beliefs and values that undergird the different policy proposals or theories about how we allocate resources for the benefit of society. And we described this as having, social justice implications. So I wanted to say very quickly that what we meant by that was really, in a lot of ways, trying to understand how do we marshal all the resources that we have available to us, including financial and non-financial, with a focus on having the best possible outcomes for all of the members of our society. And today our focal group is, of course, the Chicanx Latinx community. And so as I move along, and the reason why I describe this as responsive investment, certainly there's a lot of potential for investment. We can clearly do better. Responsiveness is really about saying what happens when we place a certain group at the center of our thinking. And to this, I had a professor at UC Santa Cruz named Bettina Aptaker, who was in women's studies, a feminist scholar. And she would ask us often to say, what happens when we place women at the center of our thinking in any analysis? And so I'm asking us to think about what happens to all of the numbers and to the lived experience that you and your colleagues might confront in the work that you do. Place that at the center of our thinking, and then let's talk about investment. Investment, as I've learned from the various research projects that I've been a part of, either as a leader or as a contributor, is actually a much more complex idea when it comes to education. All of us are, at least, I don't know, I'm old enough now that people try to get me to think about whether I invested wisely for my retirement. The answer is no. And so that's all right. So to start off with, it's sort of to ask ourselves, as we titled the book, right, to what ends and by what means. So here we're saying, what are the goals, right? So clearly expanding access to higher education is one of those goals. But there are tandem goals, and there are also perhaps sub-goals or steps along the way to get us to that point. And also, what are the means, right? So in my mind, I always think about resources, and I think about resources very broadly. So again, we have the lay of the land, right, that Dr. Contreras has provided through the snapshot data that she shared with us. So in an effort to place at the center of our thinking the Chicanx, Latinx community, I've pulled out a list of folks, and I've purposely avoided the S word, right, student. That's a very particular institutional identity. And I do that because I want us to really think about the human experience behind all of these different labels that we have for the within group diversity that exists so widely in the Chicanx Latinx community. So as we were listening to the statistics, right, we have a representation of bilingual youth, special needs children, kids growing up in poverty situations, foster care youth, children of color, immigrant or migrant youth, first child in the family to go to college. Right, our first generation college students. So as we're contemplating the potential for investment, I think that what has been often very frustrating to me and my colleagues who work in the field of school finance, especially those of us who are researchers and also therefore professors and mentors of young people who represent a wide range of lived experience, there's a way in which the education of the Chicanx Latinx community has often been framed in terms of cost, right? So perhaps some of these phrases and these responses to what it will take to achieve the kind of expansion of access that we're talking about will be familiar. So one is, it costs more to educate them. We're throwing money at the problem. Your gain is my loss. So that phrasing, that understanding that we're all very familiar with, I would say, that we're always asked to think in terms of trade-offs and zero-sum games. And so that's what happens, I believe, when you only focus on what it costs financially in order to accomplish some kind of goal. And realistically, we know there are multiple demands on limited financial resources that the state and local area agencies have to work with. Clearly, so I'm not asking us to totally suspend reality, although I will say that reality is often my least favorite concept. Okay. So now, when we think about responsiveness with respect to investment, now this is where the research that I've done has been so instructive, because I was able to have conversations with folks who are carry out a wide range of leadership positions, some of whom represent themselves this identity of being from the Latinx, Chicanx community, but not everyone. Right? Certainly folks who are very dedicated to those communities. And so what I learned from them is that there are at least two dimensions that we might want to think about when it comes to investing in a responsive manner. The first has to do with how investment is very relational to folks who work in providing, I'll be very specific, providing certain kinds of wraparound services, working with parents, cultivating the talents of youth so that they are civically engaged as well as able to begin to see a variety of potential roles that they would play in the community in the future. So the first dimension of investment here is relational, right? So my success is actually tied to your success. And there is an abundance. There is enough success to go around. And so earlier when we're thinking about how is it that a state like California could rank at the bottom of having students going on to a four-year institution, how is that even possible? Well, sometimes that might come to pass because we're still in that zero-sum game of thinking about how we invest and trying to figure out if a certain group of students is invested in, does that automatically mean that my children now are automatically going to lose out, or that our society loses out by virtue of focusing on a particular group? The folks that I met who were working with the Chicanx Latinx community very actively as educational and community leaders never thought about their work in that manner. Quite the opposite. Some of them actually could look out into those communities and see themselves in some fashion, their younger selves, right, being sort of reliving some of those same experiences and the barriers and the same kinds of mysterious understanding only a part of what it takes to get to college and not knowing who to ask. And so they felt very connected, and they understood that their own success in the future or their own well-being in the future was very much and inextricably linked to the future success of the next generations. Also, temporally. So there's this temporal dimension to investment, which maybe most of us are more familiar with, right? So resources allocated today produce positive returns over the short and long term. So what I want to suggest is that that's a pretty common understanding, right? So I have, I'm going to say some of my best friends are economists, and so this is something that they're constantly thinking about. How can we invest money today, or conversely, when we're looking at competing options, how do we do some sort of present value analysis so that we can anticipate that the return is actually going to be worth that initial cost, right? But I'm going to have us focus for a second on the long term. So raise your hand if you've ever personally and individually invested in someone else's education without really knowing whether that would directly benefit you in any fashion. Thank you. And so through the research I was doing, it was profound to me to see that there was this very long-term perspective about investing in education, and this included financial investment, that folks would even make sacrifices, including parents, Latinx parents making sacrifices in order to realize or to work toward the realization of an aspiration that had to do with education and improving one's well-being over the long haul, whether or not they would directly benefit and whether or not they would actually live to see it. So for anyone who's in the room who feels like their own educational pathway was shaped in significant ways by either their firsthand experience with the civil rights movement or their knowledge of it, perhaps in college or through community sources, we can understand that feeling, right, of saying, I'm connected to what could happen and could be better in the future, and I'm going to invest in that, even if I don't live to see it. Right? I think that's a very vivid idea. And so I took away from this research this idea of responsive investment, that communities are already inclined, perhaps, to think about investment in much more complex ways than the cost versus investment sort of binary that we're often left with in education. So now returning to this list, and this is a photo that we got from online sources, but I was very happy to see that it was showcasing the leadership retreat that happens annually at my campus at UC Davis. Oh, that's your email. So perhaps a question from the audience. Anyway, so that's okay. So, Franny. So then let's return to this list, right? And let's not only rehumanize it, but understanding like what does it look like, in fact, when there are generations ahead of this particular cohort of student leaders who had some belief in the potential for positive outcomes and college participation and invested in it, and then now we see it come to fruition. So we know that there are faculty, staff, and community members, parents, others, who have made it their business, right, to be able to establish things, including, I see representatives here from my campus, from our LatinX, Chicanx, Retention Center, for example, and others, right, faculty in the room. So that when we see this same list, we're starting to see perhaps other ways in which our own work becomes situated in the possibilities of responsive investment. And that we start to see not just the needs that we're investing in order to overcome, but in fact that it seems logical, right, or it should, that if we start first with the strengths that the community members represent, it allows us to have even more resources to work with as we seek together to overcome those needs, right? To really meet the needs and overcome the barriers. So that, when we're confronted with some of the challenges that students represent, we want to move away from a model that says, first we have to label you by your deficiencies, and then we'll help you. Typically, the community leaders that I was able to work with in my research had a very much, an assets or strengths-based approach to the work that they did, and so saw first the brilliance and the potential, and then, of course, were realistic in confronting the needs and the barriers. So what we're asking for then, when we're thinking about responsiveness to Latinx student needs and strengths, really what happens is that what emerges is a leadership imperative at multiple levels, right? So that means, what do I mean by that? So when we're talking about the metaphor of the educational pipeline, what my one of my co-authors, Lisette Bristol-Cruz, and I have described it as that when you have the pipeline and we know that there's a drop-off of students, we call them leaks in the pipeline, right? Each of those leaks actually represents a moment where both resources and leadership make a tremendous difference. So resources without action are just going to sit there, right? So we know that behind every action of investment, that means that there's leadership that had to take place. Sometimes the leadership is very much behind the scenes, and other times we know that, it's the thankless job of the school principal, for anyone who's been a principal, or teacher leaders who have taken on and gone above and beyond in order to meet or overcome barriers, meet needs and overcome barriers. So what this calls upon us to do then is to think about how we can more critically examine the funding mechanisms that we do have that are aimed at certain constituents or student needs, again, placing Latinx and Chicanx students at the center of our thinking. Whether it's the local control funding formula and the associated local control and accountability plans, or whether it's taking on the issue of college affordability, which continues to be such a surmounting challenge for many, many people of all walks of life, but certainly affecting the Chicanx, Latinx community. Also, where the legislature and others have been very mindful of how to put in enough flexibility so that local entities are able to do what they need to do because they are, in fact, closer to the issues. At the same time, having the presence of mind to incorporate some guidelines, if not requirements, around inclusion, that our job in sharing that responsibility from a leadership perspective is to make sure that those efforts are in fact meaningful, that there's meaningful inclusion and input opportunities for parents and communities, particularly when they are written into policy and law. And again, using a strengths or assets-based approach versus a cultural deficits-based approach. And just to make that more concrete for those who don't engage in the parlance that is so common in the university. Cultural-based deficits merely means that when we see that there is some form of, we'll call it underachievement, or perhaps a group not quite meeting the aspirations that they might have for themselves or their communities, that rather than explaining that by blaming the cultural backgrounds of those communities, that instead we're more reflective, first of all, to say that there are perhaps many structural barriers that we have to engage with and understand, and in some cases dismantle. But also that when we only see the deficiencies, that means we're not necessarily looking for the strengths. And so understanding that it can radically shift how we proceed when we first start with understanding that if someone is on the pathway to higher education, even if they don't know what it's going to take to get there, there are many strengths that we can work with, including the aspiration itself. It's already a starting point to know that someone's already engaging with those possibilities without being prompted. And so I will turn it back to my colleague to wrap it up.
Thank you so much, Gloria. So I want to take you back to a time in California, way back, to a time in California where we actually did see an asset-based approach in the state in terms of public policy. Take you back to a time where we actually saw a growth in the number of students, right, at the K-12 system. So does anyone know the generation where we saw a growth in students at the K-12 level? Huge growth, where we couldn't meet the demand. What generation? Baby boomers. It was the baby boomers. That's all right. You're not going to be tested, but it was the baby boomers. It was the baby boomers, right, where we saw a number of students, just influx into the K-12 system, and then we had to plan for enrollment demand at the higher ed level. California wasn't necessarily ready. So how did California respond at that time? How did California respond to this growth in K-12 students, this expansion in the educational enterprise of what is now California? We responded by investing. We responded by growth. We responded in a way that was an asset-based approach. So what happened? California built schools. Clark Kerr led the master plan committee. The master plan evolved in the 1960s. So yes, it was intertwined with this political climate of hopefulness and activism, but there really was a responsible leadership imperative around investing in the educational enterprise of the state of California. And so with the baby boomers, we saw K-12 schools being built. We saw the UCs invested in. We saw a clear kind of line and plan for how higher education was to unfold in the state of California that prioritized education. And I note that because today, as we've seen, in the past 2 decades, an influx of students, growth in demography among Latino students, growth, across the K-12, but also in higher education, are we seeing the level of investment that we saw generations before? And the answer is obviously no. And so we're not seeing higher education institutions being built to the same scale to meet those demands. We're not seeing K-12 schools being built or constructed. In fact, our children of color, are being educated in portables. When they can't meet the demand, we see portables. How many of you have seen those in K-12 schools? Have you visited K-12 schools where you have them in trailers? Our children are being educated in trailers. And so we have to be critical about whether or not that level of investment or divestment is okay. It's not okay. And so I wanted to take you back to that time because, in the 1960s, it really was framed as a level of investment. But today, children are more diverse. There are children of color that's largely intertwined with a political climate that's largely anti-Latino, anti-immigrant. And we're seeing very different approaches to the educational enterprise and level of investment that we once saw. However, in California, we still see glimmers of hope in terms of the policy context. And I wanted to mention a few propositions in the last election cycle. And that is Proposition 58, which was approved by over 77% of the California voters. It repealed Proposition 227 and supported dual immersion and multilingualism. I write about this in my own research and then have a book with Patricia Gandra on this topic. And one of the chapters relates to, the fact that we are one of the few developed nations in the world that has seen throughout history bilingualism and multilingualism as a deficit rather than an asset. If you go to any other country, many of you are well-traveled, you see children by middle school speaking 3 to 4 languages as the norm. And so for us, we're late to that game of understanding the benefits of bilingualism, not only cognitively, but socially. Proposition 57 is a community college bond and K-12 facility investment of $9 billion. It was passed with 53% of the voters. And then we saw Proposition 55, which is taxes for wealthy families making over $250,000. Some of the policy levers and recommendations we wanted to highlight and open it up then for response and discussion are a starting point to kind of move the conversation forward and actually create a policy agenda where we actually are critical about the levels of investment we're seeing in Latino students to expand access and opportunity. And those include hearings on issues pertinent to Latinos in education, hearings that actually lead to tangible recommendations, analysis of the local control funding formula, that we still need to be critical and provide analysis for meeting the needs of subpopulations under local control. In theory, it's a wonderful idea, but we still have, and this is a plethora of research on this, inter-district, school-within-school phenomenon, inter-district differences in terms of resource allocations, meaning middle-class, affluent parents who are at the table are shaping policy for communities, and many communities of color are left out of those discussions of how resources are allocated. We need to continue our English language learner critical analysis on English language learners. I mentioned that data for the dropout, for the graduation rate being lower for English language learners in the state of California. So we really need concerted policy to ensure that we don't see long-term English language learners, essentially. That those students that are English language learners, if they start in the K-12 system at a young age, theoretically, we should see them transition out of programs related to English language learning. HSIs, investing in HSI systems in California to actually see a systemic approach to the fact that we have a critical mass in all segments of our public education systems in California. But do we have infrastructures to support student success? Are we ready for those students that are within our higher education halls in terms of ensuring not only that they're equipped to graduate from these four-year institutions, but are they thriving? Are they going on to be faculty members? Are they leading in STEM? Are they becoming the thought engineers of our country? And so those are the types of questions where we need to be at if we are to remain the 5th largest economy in the world. And then assessing the role of community colleges, understanding the impact of the Student Success Act. There's a lot of work that's being done around the Student Success Act, but are our models of understanding student success outdated? And some of my most recent work is that most of the students in community colleges, Latino students, are part-time students. The models that we have for assessment in the Community College Data Mart pertain to the full-time student. And so we need to revisit those 1960 models of how we're assessing data and student outcomes. What efforts can be made to ensure greater affordability across segments? Of course, we need to continuously think about what are the cost controls and financial aid if we really want to consider the impediments to college attainment. It's very costly. Student debt levels are very high. I know the students are nodding in the room, but this is a really very pressing issue, not only for our state, but our country in terms of cost control. If we are to seriously think about college attainment and college graduation and increasing college graduation rates. And so with that, I'm happy to turn it over, but all of this to say that, Gloria raised issues around investment and framing, and I want to leave you with that idea that we really have to consider not only the economic sustainability of California and who will make up our population. Will we be able to enjoy the parks? Will we be able to enjoy the many services that we see in our state if we're not investing now in the next generation? And so this is a time for us we're at a critical moment in history in our state to think about not only how we're investing, but how we're passing on the infrastructure of California, how we're passing on the blueprint for the next generation of Californians. Thank you.
All right, my turn. I want to thank my fellow panelists for their presentations. I'm Kevin Kiley. I represent the 6th Assembly District. It's not too far from here. And I will say I think my take on this is going to be a little bit different than the other panelists here. And I just want to start with sort of the undeniable reality that California is utterly failing its Latino students. It's failing many other students, but in particular, it's failing its Latino students. And I'm going to focus on K-12, then make a couple other points related to higher education specifically. But I'm someone who grew up around this area. I had the great fortune of going to a really, really good set of public schools. I've never taken that for granted. I know how I wouldn't have had the opportunities that I've had in life without that. But after college, I joined an organization called Teach for America, and I was placed to teach at a school in inner city Los Angeles, a high school there. It's kind of, everyone knows LA. It's right across from the Coliseum by USC. A lot of just wonderful teachers and students and folks there, but a historically very underperforming school. Predominantly Latino. I think it was about 80% Latino, 20% African American. I taught 10th grade English. The average reading level of my students was 5th grade. But a big focus of my efforts was this idea of trying to promote college readiness. So one thing that I did when I was in high school myself, I was really active on the speech and debate club. And this is actually how I kind of got interested in becoming a lawyer and politics and that sort of thing. They didn't have that at this school, and it's an activity that's that is increasingly and very much so nowadays a college preparatory activity. So we started a team and got dozens of kids involved. Went to tournaments around the state. They got to interact with students from all over the state, different schools, different backgrounds, and a number of those kids have really gone on to some great colleges. And I now feel very fortunate to have the opportunity to work on education policy on the Assembly Education Committee and the Assembly Higher Education Committee. But I also had the chance when I was teaching to see firsthand just how inadequate our state's approach to public education is. And I'm sorry, professors, but a lack of investment really is not the issue. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there's some pretty just horrifying data when it comes to how kids in California are performing relative to kids in other states. So we talk about the achievement gap, which is a huge, huge problem, but let's look at another achievement gap, and that's how students of a particular demographic in California do compared to how those students of that same demographic do in other states. So if we take, for example, students eligible for free and reduced lunch. These are kids, basically living in poverty. And if you look at how California ranks that group of students versus how that same group is doing in other states, and you look at across, 4th grade math, 4th grade English, 8th grade math, all the different, the numbers are like 45, 47, 49, 50. I think there's even a 51 because we include DC. If you look at English language learners, how are English language learners in California doing versus English language learners in other states? And same story. It's like 45, 47, 48, 49. So, the failure of our public education system is one that is holistic, I would say, but it is poor, underserved students who bear the brunt of these failures. And now, having been in the legislature, I'm actually seeing very directly the link that this has to policy. And, you can go back, and there's a lot, this is a very long story, but it's one that has been a lot about the interest groups that dominate politics at the Capitol. I'll give you one example. Governor Schwarzenegger in 2005 had what he called a year of reform or something like that. There was a series of education reform initiatives, and the California Teachers Association, which automatically gets dues from every California teacher, spent something like $38 million to oppose this set of initiatives that dealt with teacher tenure reform and a few other topics. So this year, I've seen in the Assembly just the great difficulty that getting even the most modest reforms in education legislators are confronted with when they try to do this. I'll give you a few examples. There was one legislator, Blanca Rubio, who had a bill that would have made it a little easier and more opportunities to authorize charter schools. And amazingly, this passed the Assembly Education Committee by a 4-3 vote. We had 2 Republicans, I was one of them, and 2 Democrats who voted for it. Bipartisan measure, and by a Democratic author who herself was not on the committee as well. Unfortunately, this then went to the Assembly Appropriations Committee, and their work kind of happens behind closed doors, and it was killed. We had another bill, another real actual landmark moment for our committee, the Assembly Education Committee, which never passes education reform, dealing with teacher tenure reform. And this is a very modest proposal. Right now in California, you're granted tenure after 2 years, which basically means that a principal needs to make a decision on you at 18 months of teaching, whether to keep you for life or to send you elsewhere. And so this bill, which is much less than almost every other state, so this bill would have expanded that from 2 years to 3 years and also given you an option to, if someone's sort of a borderline case, to give them 5 years to figure out whether to grant them tenure or not. And this was brought by Assemblywoman Shirley Weber, also a Democrat. It passed in the Assembly Education Committee, 2 Democrats voting yes, 2 Republicans voting yes, bipartisan measure. Well, this proved to be a little too much, again, for the Appropriations Committee, but it didn't kill this one. It just completely watered it down, so as to make it so now it's just you have the opportunity to extend from 2 to 3 rather than being automatically 3 with the opportunity to extend until 5. So that did pass the Assembly, but then it went to the Senate, and the various interest groups kind of went at it there, and the bill did not end up passing. I wish Senator Allen was here today because he's actually chair of the Senate Education Committee, and he might have some insights on its prospects for next year. He's actually been one of the more reform-oriented folks, and I would like to get his perspective on that, but I do believe that bill will be coming back. Then there was a bill that I introduced, and this was a bill that was meant to give disadvantaged groups better and more options in terms of the public school that they go to. And there are some people who have it out for charter schools. So this didn't even deal with charter schools. This is just traditional public schools. And all this bill said is we dealt with 3 groups, and there are actually a few of the groups you listed up there on one of your slides. Foster youth, English language learners, and students eligible for free or reduced lunch schools. We said that they should have the ability to transfer school districts if they wanted to. If they wanted to go to a different school district that's next door, that offered more opportunities, that was a better fit for them. If you're one of these 3 groups, free and reduced lunch, foster youth, English language learner, then you should have that right. Because what's happening, and we had a witness there to testify about this, is a woman who actually testified that she was homeless at a certain point in time, but has really worked hard and wants to give her son, who I think was 8 or 9 years old, a chance at a good education. So she actually had moved to Torrance because of the schools there, but as it turned out, the particular boundaries where she lived was the Los Angeles Unified School District, not the Torrance School District. But she really wanted her kid to go to Torrance, and that was also closer to where he worked and that sort of thing. She worked, but the Los Angeles Unified School District kept denying the transfer request. That's the current law, is you have to get permission from the district that you originate in, the one that you are supposed to go to by virtue of where you live, even if you have another district that is willing to take you. And so LAUSD kept it because if you lose the student, you lose the money. And so our bill would have just said, no, you can't stop them from going. You should, if you're one of these 3 groups, English language learner, free and reduced lunch, foster youth, then you should be able to go to that other school district that's a better fit for you if they're willing to take you. So this bill failed by a 4-3 vote in the Assembly Education Committee. There were 2 Republicans, I'm one of them who voted for it, 1 Democrat, Shirley Weber, the same legislator who's the author of the teacher tenure reform bill. And I don't mean to make this partisan, but I kind of have to in a sense because this is, it was one party that killed it. The Sacramento Bee the next day had an editorial. And, this is the Sacramento Bee. I don't know if anyone reads the Bee. This isn't the Wall Street Journal, This is the Sacramento Bee's editorial page. The headline is, Democrats reject an opportunity to help kids in need of a break. And the first couple lines are, Democratic legislators claim to care about foster youth, poor students, and English language learners, so they should have readily supported legislation that would have given these students opportunities to attend a school of their choice. Next sentence, they didn't. So I say all of this just to show you that the obstacles to giving underserved students the sort of education that they need, we can debate the appropriate level of funding, but you can pour in all the money you want until we address some of the systematic ways in which the deck is stacked against students in the sort of groups that we're talking about, so they don't have access to the best educators, they don't have access to the best facilities, they don't have access to the best school leaders. We can keep pouring all the money we want. We had the slide about this millionaire's tax that passed, and it's brought all these millions more dollars. Can you show me the data showing that's led to greater student achievement among the groups that we're dealing with? Do we have data showing what the educational outcomes have been as a result of all of that influx of money? No, because that data doesn't exist, because the numbers haven't improved, because the focus is always on inputs and never on outputs, and that's a paradigm that we need to flip. There is hope because in other states, we see great things happening in terms of education reform. I'll give you one example. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans completely overhauled the way it approaches education. So now every public school basically in New Orleans is a charter school. The school district doesn't directly employ teachers and other personnel at the schools. The schools basically have autonomy and run themselves, but then they're accountable, and if you don't perform, then you don't get your charter renewed every 5 years. And there has never been anything like it in the history of this country in terms of the level of improvement that we've seen in the New Orleans school district in the last decade or so. Among the very sort of groups that we are talking about, just unbelievably impressive gains. And so I don't know why some in Sacramento are so dead set against giving poor and minority students in California those same opportunities. And and so this connects, of course, to higher education, because if we're not educating our kids in K through 12, then they're not going to have the opportunity to go to college and to succeed in college. And as just one indicator of that, look at the extraordinary levels of remedial courses that are needed, remediation that are needed for kids when they go into college. And then once you're in those remedial courses, it's like you're in quicksand. The graduation rates are very, very low after that. You look at the four-year graduation rates. I was at Cal State Dominguez Hills last weekend, and they were telling me about a lot of great things they're actually doing to fix this problem. But as of a few years ago, it was like 7-8%, the four-year graduation rate at Cal State Dominguez Hills. Sac State was not that much higher. They've done great things as well to try to improve that in the last few years. And there's also legislation this year looking at the way that we deal with remediation and trying to make it so you can start taking credit-bearing courses right away. And there are funding issues here as well. Frankly, I think that we could certainly debate whether the CSUs and UCs have gotten the funding they deserve in recent budgets. Part of the issue is that as more and more of our budget is consumed by pensions, that's one of the things in discretionary spending that gets squeezed is CSUs and UCs. At the same time, there are ways in which the systems themselves can improve. I've been a very outspoken proponent of, I guess I should say opponent of the recent rise we've seen in the cost of higher education in California. It's like 4 times more expensive tuition in the CSUs now than it was in 2000. It's like 3 times more expensive in the UCs. And I'm getting 5 minutes, okay. There's been great efforts to expand financial aid, which has helped, but it's kind of like you keep raising tuition, and you keep spending. Why don't we just try not to raise the tuition so much, right? Maybe there wouldn't be then as much need for financial aid. And it's creating real hardships and real issues of access, I think. And the state auditor has come out with a couple audits showing that there's some level of mismanagement, and we can dispute some of the claims, the degree to which they're true or not, but certainly some of them are true at the UCs. In fact, I think both systems have accepted the recommendations at the UC and the CSU that has, when you raise the cost of personnel and administration, then that's raising the cost of an education and can directly link to the tuition increases. The legislature itself is also not without blame. There was a bill this year that the CSU opposed that was pushed by SCIU, I believe, that would have made it much more difficult for CSU to enter into contracts with vendors. And so CSU came out against this, said, look, if you do this to us, it's going to be a lot more expensive, because a lot of times having a partnership for this service is a lot more cost effective to do it with a vendor and actually be able to shop around for the best deal. And they also pointed out that it would have jeopardized some of the steps they've taken to help students, for example, who are working at the same time, have families, because it would have really killed this program they've done to provide kind of online counseling. And so I spoke against this bill on the assembly floor. It's like, look, this is a direct choice between students and college affordability on the one hand and a special interest on the other. And, that bill passed. I think there was one of my friends on the other side of the aisle, Mark Levine, who voted against it. Fortunately, the governor did veto that bill. So I'll stop there, because I was getting a sign a minute ago. But I could go on. Would be happy to answer questions. One topic I didn't get the chance to mention that we might have, I think, actually a fair amount of agreement on is the need for greater career technical education, both in high schools and community colleges and four-year institutions. It's something that I think we have not adequately prioritized as a state. That has great potential to reach students who may not want to go to a four-year university, but do have the passion and desire to have a very productive career. The legislature did come in and provide some funding for that this year, and I think that's something that definitely needs to continue. And I'll give a little shout out to Sierra College, which is in my district. We just opened a fabulous advanced manufacturing lab and has partnerships with high schools in the area. So I would definitely like to see more of that going forward. Thank you.
So I would like to thank our panelists, Francis Contreras, Gloria Rodriguez, and Assemblyman Kevin Kiley. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.